Does this project or does that? Okay. Can everybody hear me? We should get started here. Yes. My wife had me put this on today, and then she, of course, didn't show up. Does anybody know half the quote? You're gonna have to go home and watch Christmas Vacation. Yeah. Why is there water on the floor, Todd? All right. So you have an assignment. Go watch Christmas Vacation tonight. It's my pleasure to introduce Katie Suding today. She is the exact type of badass ecologist we love to get at the Ecology Center speakers. She started her career at what is consistently the most selective college in the United States, at Williams College, went on to study at Michigan, and then worked at UC Berkeley, UC Davis, and is now a distinguished professor at Boulder. She has over 200 papers with over 6,000 citations. In the 2 days she spends with us, she'll probably get about 40 citations. She is also the principal investigator at one of the premier research sites for ecology in the US, the Niwot Ridge site, and yet she's not really an alpine ecologist. She hasn't pigeonholed herself. Her strength is really in being a brilliant thinker and writer. Peter told us yesterday about his experience working with her, where a few colleagues threw a few ideas at her, and a week later she had produced a funded research proposal. I had the same experience where I was worked with a dozen people at a symposium at ESA. We threw a lot of junk at her, and a few weeks later she wrote a paper that is extremely well cited on plant soil feedback. So she has a broad experience, and I highly encourage you, if you haven't talked with her yet, to try to catch her and see if you can figure out how she does it. She's probably going to say it's her passion and a lot of hard work. Unfortunately for the rest of us, I think it has to do with some innate brilliance, and I think she's going to let us in on some of that here today.
Thank you. That's awesome. Oh, thanks. It's nice to be here. And I have to say that I barely got into graduate school. Everyone didn't accept me. I had to beg the University of Michigan. So I'm going to talk about some things that I've been working on recently about trying to think of a kind of a general framework, putting together some ideas about environmental change and biodiversity change. And I just want to start, I know this is like, I'm leaving tomorrow morning, but I would really like people's feedback on this and things that might make sense, things that make no sense, kind of working through these ideas. So please get in touch if you have any ideas, because I really would welcome those kind of things as I kind of work through these ideas myself. So, and I first want to just make sure to acknowledge that I'm going to talk about several different projects that are contributed by a ton of people in my research group over the last decade. And so I'm going to try to acknowledge them. But in general, just want to make sure to take the time to say that this is an incredible team effort, and some of these ideas that I'm going to talk to you about, as well as pretty diverse funding sources in terms of how these projects kind of eventually came together. So just want to make sure to acknowledge that before I dive in. So I want to talk about two kind of concurrent crises that we're kind of experiencing in the world today. And I know that a lot of you are thinking about this as well. So the first one would be the climate crisis, about how climate is changing, and kind of started thinking about environmental change a little bit kind of tangentially, or a little bit kind of thinking about it's going to happen, but not sure. And now we're dealing with data sets where we're seeing it actually happen, right? Seeing those changes on the ground, and those changes. I want to also point out, here's a figure from The Economist a couple years ago about kind of pretty climate scientists have done a fairly good job there's been some bumps in the road, but kind of communicating kind of different possible futures, right? And different ways that our decision making might change kind of what the climate will be in the next 50 years, century. The other crisis that I think a lot about and I'm really concerned about is the biodiversity crisis, and the idea about that we're kind of on the edge of losing a lot of species and changing a lot of biodiversity across all sorts of systems globally. And I want to also point out that when we think about futures or possible futures in terms of these types of changes, I think we are less clear or less articulate about what the possible futures would be, other than we're going to lose a lot of species, right? But the idea about predicting, the different types of trajectories that might be occurring, we're really not as kind of mature in our science about. And I point out these two examples about United Nations efforts. First of all, last decade about about biodiversity targets, which were declared a massive failure because we were basically unable to do meet any of the targets. And then also this decade, which is the decade of ecosystem restoration, and thinking about how we might be able to improve biodiversity that way. The jury's still out on this idea about thinking about restoration. But I have to say that it is a challenge that is super hard to think about how this actually will materialize in stemming this crisis. One of the things when I think about this intersection between climate change and biodiversity change, and how we might kind of think about these two things together, is the challenge that what we see on the ground in terms of more local level biodiversity change. It's all over the place when we look at long-term records about what is happening. And so here is a super cool data set. And if you're interested in temporal changes at all, you should probably just check it out. So this is called the BioTime data set, and it's monitoring data sets about just biodiversity over time across all sorts of different systems globally. Okay, so so each one of these lines is a different data set. You can think about it this way, and this is species richness. And this is just changed based on when the data set started to when it ended. And I guess I don't really need to tell you that some places species richness is increasing, some places species richness is decreasing, some places species richness is totally flat. Okay, and the grand mean across this is basically no change. Okay, so that's pretty tough to think about this type of change, and then thinking about how do we put that in a management policy kind of framework. The other thing that this data set really drives home is, okay, so the change is idiosyncratic, or it's happening it's very variable across the page. But it's also that if you look at composition similarity, so how a place starts in terms of their diversity and how it changes over time, it is changing over time. Okay, so there's no question about that. And so this is index of compositional similarity on the y-axis, and virtually all those data sets, even though diversity is going every which way, they're all declining over time, right? They're getting less and less similar over time, right? So across the board, most places there's compositional change going on, right? So we are changing the biodiversity, but how and in what direction is all over the place. Okay, that's a pretty tough challenge, right? Like, how are we going to make sense about what to do in these kind of cases? This high variability, but it's also this constant, like, we are changing, right? We can't just expect to try to manage these systems and keep them unchanged, right? Things are happening, right? The environment is changing. So what I want to talk about, and kind of what I've been trying to think about and putting together in some sort of framework based on kind of my experiences and the systems that I've worked in, is, so we have this issue of high variability, but also high levels of change across the board. And so how can we make a framework that's not stopping change or trying to avoid change, but thinking about different types of change, and how thinking about different systems, because of their structure and because of the types of drivers that are affecting that system, might change in predictable ways. And whether that kind of framework about there's different types of change, and whether that would be helpful in terms of guiding how we might manage that system and how we might anticipate or try to guide those trajectories of change. Okay, so I want to start here as kind of this overall framework, and I'm drawing this from just kind of some really general concepts, and I'm going to try to apply some concepts and kind of complexity science about how we kind of might think about this kind of highly variable, highly idiosyncratic system into trying to provide some generalities out of it. So I'm gonna present my thoughts today in terms of thinking about external drivers. So these are drivers that are, you can think about pushing the system. And I think a lot of us here are working on specific external drivers, right? Whether that is, pollution, whether it's climate change, whether it's harvesting or some sort of kind of population level pressure. And then thinking about how a system, which is, I'm just showing it right here with these perhaps these different nodes being different species or different genotypes, different components in terms of nutrients, all connected, right? So that how that system might be pushed, right, and change, and then how it might, the outcome would be the changes in abundance or diversity, that might be the pattern that we're trying to predict. We're trying to anticipate, and we're trying to guide. And I think that's really important point, is thinking about how might we guide the outcomes, right? In terms of conservation, management, restoration. Okay, so thinking about this type of framework and how that might be a useful thing. Some people might think about that as kind of direct effects of environmental abiotic drivers versus indirect effects about how they're going to change that system, right? And how much is it controlled by the system and the interactions versus the external controls. I'm going to try to translate some of those external drivers, not in terms of the type of driver, whether it's pollution, whether it's harvesting, whether it's climate, but thinking about what they are doing to the system. So trying to invoke some of the mechanisms and some of the stuff that ecology has worked on for decades in terms of how those external drivers might be affecting the system. And today, I'm going to talk about external drivers in terms of whether they're changing resources, so food, nitrogen, whatever the limiting kind of resources in the system, whether they're affecting stress, so kind of reducing biomass, making a place harsher to live in, or whether it's changing variability, so changing kind of the degree of extremes and the degrees of control. Okay, so kind of a different way of thinking about how these pushes, but doing this allows you to invoke a ton of work on things like succession, things about resource availability and the structuring of communities, things about compensation, compensatory dynamics, external variability. And so it allows us not to have to recreate new ideas about environmental change, but kind of carry on and translate some stuff that ecology has been working on for a long, long time. And then in this thinking about how do you deal with this complex system and all these ways that this complex system might change. I thinking about how we can generalize how these systems are organized. And so there's different ways of thinking about it. And so, but thinking about a system in terms of their nodes and the important interactions within a system. So if you're working with large mammals and, you know, herbivores in the system, right, you kind of think about these important levers, right, and these important types of interactions between different types of species, also between kind of food and resources, for instance. And so thinking about it in a multi-trophic food web. Also can think about it in terms of soil systems with kind of networks about different types of plants interacting with different types of soil microbes, right? And all those kind of interactions still the same way. So we kind of take these same kind of approaches to describe systems, regardless of how we're thinking about or what kind of system we're working in. We really think about these interactions, right? And where the resources flow. I'm going to take a perspective today, thinking about one trophic level, just plants and how they interact with each other. Okay, and so those interactions are for resources mostly, and they can be positive interactions. A lot of them we assume are negative interactions across this one community of many species. Okay, but I think a lot of times thinking about systems, you can think about many different lenses on terms of what system is really important for the question you're asking. And then even to simplify it, so how would species, am I doing it? I don't know. How would species kind of interact, right? What kind of interactions cause different structuring of a system or of a community, right? And I want to propose a couple of them that I see in my work. And some of these are kind of specific, perhaps, to plant communities, but you can think about these as kind of motifs, or I think about them as topologies that I think most people working in systems can think about a couple different ways that a system can be organized. And so I want to talk about those right now. So first of all, thinking about a system where there is one kind of dominant species that kind of controls the game. Okay, so the species, maybe a strong competitive hierarchy, if you're thinking about competition, where the rest of the species kind of fill in the gaps, but there's one species that is able to take up most of the resources, oftentimes most abundant, right? And then that whatever that species does really dictates what the other species do. And so I'm going to call that dominance control. Another way we think about how our communities are structured, and so when we think about that in terms of how those interactions might play out, I'm just showing a gradient. This could be, I think, a lot about traits, but this could be like just the different species and their abundances. And you think about the dominant species has some sort of optimal strategy, an optimal trait, and then the competitive hierarchy kind of would be arranged on either side of that, right? The species that are kind of close to that strategy probably do the next well, right? And species that are very far from that kind of optimal mode would be the ones that are kind of just scraping by on the edges and probably less abundant. Another way we can think about how systems are structured is what I'd call negative frequency control. And so this is that there's strong density dependence, but it's more density dependence of the species themselves versus their intra-specific interactions. Okay, so that when a species gets really abundant, they start doing less well because there's a lot of interactions among conspecifics. Okay, so species by species interactions are less strong and interactions within species are more strong. When you have this dynamic, then you can have these trade-offs, right? One species can increase, population can increase really rapidly when it's rare. Then as it gets more abundant, its population would slow, and a species that's rare would have an advantage and be able to increase. And there's an advantage here not that you're the same, that you're being driven to this optimal trait, but there's an advantage that you're different, right? And so that you're able to get the resources that no one else can get, right? You have different strategies. And so thinking about that in this kind of simple schema, it'd be kind of pulling the system apart, right? That diversity, that differences really give an advantage if the system is structured this way. And then this is one that's a little bit, this is one that I think about a lot, but it's probably a little bit specific to particular systems. But thinking about positive feedbacks and controls, and so that there's an advantage when you're abundant because you can affect the rest of the system. And so as you get more abundant, you affect the system in a way that increases your population growth rate. Okay, so these are probably a little bit more specialized. Some of this could be with trophic interactions. Some of the stuff that I work on is with plant soil interactions, that a species becomes more abundant. It influences its soil microbial community to its own advantage, right? So then it can get more abundant, right? And so you have those types of dynamics. In these kind of systems, what you expect is actually a divergence of traits and actually kind of a bimodal kind of push, right? So you might have a really strong gradient and a really strong line where a community with a dominant species is affecting the system in one way, and then another way, and then the strong line versus these gradients of continuous change. And so that's where you'd see thresholds and more kind of rapid transitions. Okay, so those are the three that I've been kind of thinking about in my work. I would imagine that different people might think about different ways that their system is arranged. And so today I want to talk about how I've been trying to use some data to try to help inform whether this framework can be helpful and how we might start thinking about environmental change with this idea about external drivers and this internal topology. What I want to also emphasize here is that when we think about interventions, I'd like to try to make the argument that this might be really important if we're trying to think about successful management under environmental change. And why is that? Because if we're thinking about affecting these external drivers, a lot of times that means a global or regional intervention, right? How do we slow down warming? That's something that's really hard for a manager to do. Like weather is kind of out of a manager's control, I often think, right? And so those are things that you have to deal with. You have to deal with that change, but it's harder to actually intervene, except for at the policy level, right? So, but that when we're thinking about interventions at the local level, those are almost always at this scale, right? Changing some species, trying to remove a species, trying to add some species, trying to add grazing so this species doesn't get out of control, right? And so that's at this local level. So understanding how this works, that's where we would have our levers, right, to manage and to restore and to conserve, at least at the local level. I'd also like to argue, and I hope I give you some examples of this, is that you do different management based on these topologies. You wouldn't always just remove the dominant species. You'd expect way different dynamics. So one management strategy would absolutely not fit all those topologies in the same way. So it's really something that it actually might be that understanding that structure of the system is key to understanding how to intervene in this kind of changing environment. Okay, I'm going to give you, I'm going to talk about three different systems, three different projects that I want to just kind of talk about how maybe these different dynamics could be framed in this way. And I chose these three very specifically to kind of show the differences in these systems that are organized in these different ways. Okay, so I hope that at least that's what's forming my lens through this is my kind of experiences in these different systems. I also want to make sure I will talk about, and I've chosen these examples for different ways that you might get at what is the structure of the community and kind of see how that structure changes. And what I'm trying to push myself towards is you can do a lot of really detailed experiments, but some of that is really hard to scale up and actually be relevant for management. And so what can we do with monitoring data sets? What can we do with observational data as well to kind of yes, it's more inference, but it's more broadly applicable too, right? So how can we move forward in that? And then I also want to make sure to just talk about kind of what these results might mean for management in a pretty broad way, but at least a little bit to try to convince you that yes, you would do different things depending on these kind of different pathways. Okay, so the first project I want to talk about is from my work up in Niwot Ridge in the Alpine Tundra. So this is high mountain above tree line, diverse. I guess you could call it a grassland. It's dominated by long-lived perennial herbaceous species. I want to shout out to two of my colleagues, Courtney Collins and Emily Farrer, who were instrumental in this, as well as Sarah Elmendorf. Okay, so here we have a long-running experiment that's been running for, I'm going to show you data for 15 years. It's been running a little longer now, where we've manipulated some of the kind of the environmental drivers in the system. So snow, nitrogen, simulating atmospheric nitrogen deposition and warming in this site. Okay, and we've done this actually in an all factorial design, which is kind of a little crazy to show you. So I'm not going to really emphasize the factorial nature of the design, but kind of these temporal changes and thinking about, okay, you get a system and you're pushing it, right? I'm pushing it by adding more nitrogen, or I'm pushing it by warming, right? Or both together. How is the system changing, and why is it changing differently in these different cases? Okay, so that's the goal. And I want to emphasize here, when thinking about environmental drivers, warming is acting, and show you some data on this, but warming is acting as a stress. It's actually increasing its soil dryness, and so it's actually reducing production. So that's just what's happening in the system when we warm it. Adding nitrogen, nitrogen is a strong limiting factor here. So generally productivity increases quite a bit with an increased nitrogen, so a resource addition as well. And I'm going to just summarize some of actually these results by thinking about interactions in a very simple way, thinking about the dominant. So this is one plant, Distantia cespitosa. It's a bunch grass, and it is very abundant, generally around 40% abundance. And then the subdominant species, I'm going to show you results of the next 3 species in terms of their abundance combined. And then the moderate species. So if you think about a rank abundance curve, there's a lot of species in this system that are between 5% and 3% abundance, but still frequent. They still are present in every plot. And so I'm going to show you kind of some summarized data that way to think about the structure. Okay, so this is what happens, and I'm gonna just emphasize these 3 treatments for now. In ambient conditions, things actually don't change much. There's some changes, but the change in the tundra is fairly slow. With warming, we get this shift, And actually the dominant doesn't do as well. So there's a decrease in the dominant species. That's this is barely here. Okay, the dominant species tends to decrease in cover over long periods. And then when we look at warming and nitrogen and snow, there's a pretty different kind of dynamic, and the dominant species loves it and really takes off in that case. We used a approach to think about what are these changes. So these are changes I view as net changes. These are changes that could be direct effects of what we're manipulating, like nitrogen, but they also could be indirect effects. They could be density dependent effects because of other species are changing with nitrogen, right? And the species interactions are changing with nitrogen. And so to think about what are these factors that are affecting this pattern that we're seeing, there's many modeling approaches. I'm just going to show you results for this one that was developed by Jim Clark fairly recently. I don't have to, I'm not going to go into any of these details, but just to say that it partitions out the environmental control of these abundance changes, and we're putting in changes in snow, changes in nitrogen availability. And so we're there, it's looking at how those factors predict the changes over time, as well as the interaction. So looking at the covariance matrix between as one species abundance increases, what happens with other species, and then an air term. Okay, and so this is the results when we start thinking about what's affecting what. I'm going to show results like this. So like with my 3 different species groups and their interactions. And I'm gonna do this across a couple different experiments. So I'll kind of show you how I'm gonna kind of depict this to you. The size of the circle is their relative abundance. So bigger circle, they're more abundant. Their density dependence, and so how they're interacting is depicted by arrows, as you would depict probably if you're thinking about your systems that you work in, and interactions with a thicker arrow, meaning a stronger negative interaction. And then also the last thing is thinking about density independent effects are rings around the circle. So a strong density independent effect means that the population growth rate is affected by it directly by these environmental changes. Okay, so thinking about this kind of diagram for this ambient condition when we start thinking about these abundant changes. And so these are a couple of things that I would draw from this. First of all, that there's asymmetric effects of the dominant on the other species. You see those big solid arrows affecting the other species. So strong negative effects of the dominant on the other species and less strong effects of the other species on the dominant. So that's these, right? The interspecific density dependence is less in general than these. So this is the density dependence that's intraspecific versus interspecific. And so there's stronger control of the own population dynamics versus interactions, and that's a general prediction of most of coexistence work. And then the density independent effects are fairly actually mild. And so these rings about the strength of these density independent effects. And we do find some strong density independent effects on the dominant species. And that's actually via snow. Okay, so it's sensitive to snow depth, different annual variation in snow. Okay, so I would argue here that this is a case of strong dominance control. Right, the dominant species is affecting the other species very strongly, and maybe is affected by external dynamics itself, and then is structuring the other species. What's happening in these other treatments to affect these different dynamics? So with warming, we see very different dynamics when we start trying to separate out the direct effects of the environment with how the species abundances are changing over time. We see actually a shift in terms of where the competitive interactions are stronger, with the subdominant and moderate species actually starting to competitively negatively influence the dominant species. And we're seeing stronger intra-specific effects of those species. And so think about this as kind of the stress of the warming environment causing this reorganization of this system due to these changed interactions. And I can go into more detail about what the mechanism is, but it's a water use mechanism. And then if we look at the other scenario about this idea, what happens when we warm plus add nitrogen plus add snow, we see a huge increase of the dominant species, but we still see this kind of strong dominance of the dominant species, and even more amplified density dependence of the dominant species. So the dominant species is the thing that's slowing down its own population growth. So kind of think about this as kind of this intensity, this increased dominance control in this scenario. And so thinking about this, we could just look at the top, right? Just the pattern and say, well, nitrogen is kind of important for this system, and it certainly is. But kind of thinking about what is happening in terms of the structure of the community, I would argue is key to understand how these effects are playing out. And what are these effects are when they're reorganizing, right? Reorganizing the species interactions like warming is doing, versus nitrogen, which is kind of amplifying this dominance control and making the dominant even more and more dominant. So when we think about this, like, we can better understand when environmental change will reshuffle and reorganize a community, and when it'll be kind of intensify and actually cause loss of species due to intensity of already dominant species across these kind of different types of environmental change. And I want to just point out here that we are able to do this with long-term observations. So thinking about these temporal changes with these environmental manipulations. And I think this is one thing where we have been starting to do these environmental manipulations, but it's harder to go into how the species are interacting. And so now we're getting some techniques to really start at least inferring that with our data. And then lastly, what does this mean by how we might approach management in this system? And so we've been talking about this in terms of what's happening with elevated nitrogen deposition, particularly with Rocky Mountain National Park. And the idea about this intensity and this kind of driving out of rare species and increased abundance of this one bunch grass at high areas of elevated N deposition is really important for trying to maintain high diversity in this system. And so ideas about how do you reduce the dominance of this species? And we've been exploring ideas about grazing and other kind of species selective disturbances that might be able to cut down its population growth and allow other species to be maintained in the system, even with high nitrogen. Okay, I want to shift over to a kind of a different system, and I would argue a different type of organization now. This is work that's done in a serpentine grassland in California. This is a system where it's still a small stature, but it's all annual species and also highly diverse. This is in conjunction with Richard Hobbs, Hal Mooney, and Lauren Hallett. So here's the pattern that we're seeing long-term in this community. And I just want to say that each of these are the 6 most abundant species. And the specific species really don't matter here. But what I want to really emphasize is that if you follow any one of those species lines, they have good years, they have bad years, right? They're kind of going up and down, but all of them are really maintained across the whole data set as strong, viable populations. We used a little different modeling approach here because we were able to actually have data on stem counts, so we could do a direct kind of population modeling approach. And so we looked at this this time series, trying to predict how one point in time predicted population size at another time the next year, thinking about population growth rates. And also an important environmental factor here is rainfall. So we kind of know that's like the critical environmental kind of direct effect. And then also thinking about terms in terms of how species are interacting in terms of their own density, as well as the density of other species. And so thinking about how that might explain these population trajectories. So the first thing we found, and why I want to argue here that I think this is a pretty good case of negative frequency dependence, and that you really care more about being different from other species and do well when you're rare and do less well when you're abundant. So here is abundance on the x-axis and per capita population growth rate on the y. And I'm highlighting, so all the colored squares are the population abundance of the species. And you can see that the population growth rates decline across the board, every single species, as the species becomes more and more abundant. And I have to say, I haven't looked at this in many data sets before starting to look at it in this data set. And I was floored because this is kind of what general ecology would predict, right? That intra-specific competition should really be an important factor, and that you should interact more strongly with individuals of your same species than with other species, because you have more similarity in terms of traits and stuff like that. And this is exactly what we're seeing, is that the population growth rates, as you get more and more abundant, you decline quite a bit. In this case, across the board for all these 6 species. And so I would diagram this as that species are controlling their own growth rates a little bit more than the interactions, and the interactions across species aren't very strong. And we actually ended up modeling this even without the interspecific interaction term was the best fit model here. So, and then what we also can see is the effect of rainfall in this system, where some species do well in wet years, and some species do well in dry years. And so there is environmental control there, and there's a trade-off here. And so just showing you that that this is growing season rainfall just standardized in dry years and wet years. And these are the different species growth rates when they're rare. And so there's a set of species that do well actually in kind of bad years or dry years, and a group of species that have higher population growth rates when wet years. And so there's this kind of trade-off here, and that's what's kind of causing this kind of changes in abundance over time. So if you think about this in terms of how the system kind of structures and how it's changing over time, in low rainfall, you get some species doing better and stronger kind of effects of density independence about the effects of rainfall, and stronger control of the self-limitation. And then in high rainfall, those things shift a bit. There's different species that are more susceptible and have stronger self-limitation, right? And so you get these trade-offs. And as long as the system continues to have wet years and dry years, the diversity should be maintained by those negative frequency dependence. And so thinking about this system is structured far differently, right? It's structured by being different from other species, not strongly structured by this one strong dominant species. We did this without any environmental manipulations or any kind of species interaction manipulations, but just having the luxury of a really long, great data set. And there's more of these coming online, right? We're getting more and more longer term monitoring data sets. And so they're really, really valuable. Why this might be important to help managers and how we've been kind of talking about this is that the idea about that there's a high growth rate when rare, but it's environmentally dependent is helpful to think about when you might add a species to a system, right? So when you might want to introduce some of the rare species, as well as when you might want to control. There's an invasive species in here, and I didn't mention that, but there's a brome species here. And the idea about controlling the population growth rate of that species, actually in certain years, when it's at low abundance, is what we would expect. What we expect would be most successful, knowing these dynamics. And that's exactly not what they were doing and what most people do in terms of invasive control, right? You control them when they're doing really well, right? When they are at high population abundance. So we've been trying those things out with some success. Okay, my last example is with some native grasslands, also in California. And this is work with Laura Lee Larios, Lauren Hallett, and Claudia Stein. And this is work across the state, some in Southern California up to Northern California. And I'm sure it's not on your minds, but there is the native grass. California has a native grass, and it's this stipa grass, and it's this bunch grass that is thought to have represented a lot of the native grassland across the whole state of California. There's a little bit of debate about how it looked in the, in 1800s, but it's thought that that was a very important component of the grasslands. And now only 1% of those grasslands remain. And it's been heavily, heavily invaded by a lot of annual grasses. And it's always struck me kind of funny that annual grasses can come in and kind of dominate over that extensive area, as well as long-term. Annual species aren't quite the ones that we would predict to have a strong foothold for a long time. And so we looked at some controls, and we're focused on nitrogen availability in this study and whether that is kind of shifting the interactions in this system. So how we looked at this, we took a kind of more experimental approach where we established both native grasslands and exotic grasslands in kind of large, kind of common garden situation, and then used a criteria about invading when rare. So thinking about, well, what if a species comes into a system when rare, how will it do, right? And will its population increase? And if its population increases, then you would expect that it would start, increasing in abundance as well. But if it doesn't, right? So if you try to invade a species and it doesn't increase when rare, that would be consistent with exclusion, right? That there's some reason that species won't be able to maintain viable populations there. So we did that with both the native and the exotic grass, and then we did it along a gradient of different nitrogen depositions. So we reduced nitrogen by adding carbon, and we increased nitrogen across this factorial design. And then the other thing that we did in this case, comparing results with an annual and a perennial is kind of comparing apples and oranges after just 1 year, right? So we integrated this experimental results in a demographic model where we parameterized based on measures of survival, recruitment, and estimates of longevity to have both kind of be put on the same type of time scale, if that makes sense. It's unfair really to expect a perennial to outperform an annual in 1 year, right? but its survivorship should lead to different population dynamics. And so we tagged individuals, we followed them over time. We looked at seed set and seed recruitment as part of this as well. And we used a population dynamic model to look at how this environmental change might affect these interactions. This is what we found, and I'm going to give you modeling results here because of that integration between the experimental work and the demographic models. When we looked at whether how exotic Avena is the species when it's able to invade, and so this is the Avena is in orange, and this is we're invading it when it's rare. This is the abundance of the native grass, and so we invade it and we kind of run the model over time. And Avena is not able to invade at low nitrogen levels, or even when we do moderate is really the ambient levels that we were working in our experiment. But at high nitrogen levels, the initially rare invader, in this case Avena, is able to come in and invade. And when we model it out, it should eventually exclude the native plant. And so that's when it is, when it's rare, right? So what happens if you shift the initial conditions around and you say, well, what happens when there's different initial conditions? And so actually, let me just do this in this schema. And so when we break this down in terms of interactions, we find strong competitive interactions by the native grasses to kind of exclude the Avena coming in, and that totally breaks down at high nitrogen, right? And that you lose that strong competitive control. So you get this real switch in competitive effects as nitrogen increases. Okay, when we think about stipa as being rare and invading in, we actually see the exact opposite results, that it can only invade in when at low nitrogen. And so we're seeing this kind of dichotomy across the gradient. And again, it's actually really interesting, but we see the shift again, but it's shifting earlier on where this Avena becomes the Nacella is able to, or stipa is able to come in at low nitrogen, but it's not able to invade at ambient levels or high in this. So we still see this switch, and it's dependent on initial conditions. So what we see if we put both of these together is that at low nitrogen, we would predict, it doesn't matter if they're starting abundant or rare, that the native grass would invade and be able to persist. And you'd expect those systems to persist as native grasslands. And moderate nitrogen is where some really interesting dynamics are happening. And it depends on who's abundant, who is able to persist, okay? And that's where we see this feedback control I'll talk about a little bit more soon. And then at high nitrogen, there's a clear competitive hierarchy where Avena comes in. And so what is happening here? So this is a situation where Avena, anything that's rare is not able to invade in, whether it's the exotic grass or whether it's the native grass. And there's strong competitive pressures of the abundant species. And so this is consistent with feedbacks that if you're abundant, you're changing the environment in ways that would kind of allow you to persist, right? And allow you to exclude others. So when Avena is abundant, it's able to exclude the native. If the native's abundant, it's able to exclude Avena at the same environmental conditions. So we see this evidence of this positive frequency dependence. So a whole different way that the system is structured at in this moderate nitrogen levels. I don't have time to talk about this, but we do know the mechanisms, and I'm just going to throw this in, that why the native grass is able to exclude the exotic grass is because of strong plant soil feedbacks and this benefit of particular fungal associations that it has, especially at high abundance. And then the interesting thing about the exotic is that it's able to have the same kind of persistence, but it's through just absolutely swamping the system with a lot of propagules. So just really high dispersal. So here we're finding that positive feedbacks really matter, particularly in this kind of intermediate environment. And so the drivers to push dominance to one or the other, you get this middle ground of hysteresis. So you get this middle ground where there's actually different states that could be created depending on the initial conditions. This is a little harder to do with observational data. And so this idea about reciprocal invasion when it's rare is actually a really good approach if you can do experimental work to kind of try to think about these types of interactions. But this is the type of interaction that causes strong non-linearities, strong feedbacks, and also these changes in resilience. What we're doing here, this was actually something that really helped in terms of thinking about how to manage grasslands in different environmental conditions that are receiving different atmospheric nitrogen deposition levels. So one thing that happened with this work is that we were really stuck by saying that at high nitrogen levels, we couldn't figure out any way that it made sense to try to restore those systems with native grasslands, because they would just get reinvaded and reinvaded by the exotic grass because of that strong competitive hierarchy that native grass or that exotic grass was always competitively superior. The low nitrogen areas, there's not that many that are still there, but those are ones where those make sense to start putting the natives in, and that eventually over time, the population should be able to persist. And in this middle ground, which is a lot of the places that we were working with moderate nitrogen inputs, if you are able to maintain the native grasslands there, they should be relatively resistant to invasion because of those feedbacks, because of that positive frequency dependence. But if the system is exotic, that you really have to invest heavily in restoration and actually increase the abundance of those natives a lot, right, to get to stop that barrier of initial conditions and kind of create those feedbacks for the natives in order for restoration to work. And so we've been working with TNC in Southern California to think about managing with those kind of guidelines. Okay, so talking about those three cases, and that hopefully tried to make the point that how the system is organized really affects how environmental change kind of propagates through the system, whether it's a dominance control situation, whether it's negatively frequency dependence, whether it's positive feedbacks, right, that there's strong self-advantage there. And so thinking about how those things might actually help heuristically, at least, think about different ways and actually different management strategies that you would take depending on that structure, that internal structure and those interactions. And I hope that this way of approaching things, at least within the plant community system, might allow at least a little bit more precision about what might be happening, right, and how maybe we should intervene. And then lastly, that the interventions that you would do in those different systems really are different, right? Whether you're focusing on kind of the resource partitioning and the functional diversity and the differences across species, or that kind of dominance control and whether how to reduce the abundance of the dominant species, or kind of the plant soil feedbacks and the importance of the initial conditions. And so doing one thing in all places really doesn't matter in a change, or really shouldn't be done in a changing environment if these internal structures do matter in a system. And then lastly, this is more idea than kind of demonstrate with you, but thinking about what might cause changes in resilience across the system versus what might cause recovery, thinking about pushes that actually might change the topology from one type of interaction structure to another might be where you see really rapid changes and loss of diversity versus if you kind of able to recover to that same type of interaction structure, even if it's different species. So thinking about that as a kind of maybe a guideline in terms of when you might see resilience and when you might not. Okay, so I just want to, so thanks for listening, and just want to call out some just really amazing colleagues that I talked about their work, and so thank you.
We're out of time for questions.
Oh,
let's
I'm sorry.
Dr. Suding again, and
What time is it? Oh, I was looking. Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
If people want to stick around, we can.
No, it's okay. Oh, that's disappointing though. I would have gone faster. I was thinking that we had more time.